Hey, true weirdos, at the end of this episode, stick around if you want for a little bonus content and conversation. You're on your way to work and you're banged up pretty good. In the ER, they find that your right knee is fractured. Your left femur is broken. So is your right arm. Bad as it is, you're lucky. Well, you were lucky, kind of. What you don't know is that your luck completely ran out the moment that car slammed into you. Never mind that you're in the hospital. Your broken bones won't be treated, not for weeks. You don't know that a doctor sees you lying there on that gurney and decides, this one is ideal. You don't know what an excellent candidate you are for a little experiment. No one will tell you what's about to happen. Consent? Forget it. No one will seek your consent. Not ever. Congratulations, I guess. You just became Human Product 12.
And make out a small beam of light against the mirror.
1. True. Weird stuff.
Atomic radiations of any kind may prove damaging to human beings. So techniques of protecting those who work with such radiations have had to be perfected. Special equipment and different kinds of protective barriers are some of the measures that have been adopted to safeguard humans. Inventing instruments to detect radiations and discovering materials that will block and stop radiations require extensive tests.
That's from an instructional film produced in the 1950s by Encyclopedia Britannica. The atomic age in America was a wildly contradictory time. On the one hand, atomic energy seemed as shiny and new and limitless as the American dream itself. On the other hand, humanity had also learned the terrible cost of unleashing nuclear power, knew the world-annihilating risks, had already seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki just how big a price there was to pay for splitting the atom. Every single human being on Earth born after 1951 has been exposed to radiation fallout from nuclear weapons testing. Every last one of us. The degree of exposure varies, though, and while for some people there might be an increased risk of cancer, for most of us that increased risk is very small. Not that anyone asked your permission to take that risk. It's just sort of baked into the idea of being born on this planet. What you might call a literal occupational hazard. The CDC puts it in the most blandly wholesome way imaginable.
Your individual dose from fallout will depend on a number of factors such as where you lived, when the testing occurred, how much time you spent outdoors, the weather, how much milk you drank, and fresh fruits and vegetables you ate, and other personal lifestyle and individual factors.
I guess the first question I have is about these lifestyle factors. When you consider that before 1963, there had been more than 500 tests of nuclear weapons conducted in Earth's atmosphere, all those particles and gases, all invisible, traveling through the atmosphere and then falling to the ground, exposing every soul in the contiguous United States to some level of radiation. All the body's organs, all the body's tissues, everyone 100% exposed. So maybe let's don't beat ourselves up for not doing enough Pilates or drinking green juice, because you can't dodge what you can't see. And how can you avoid something you don't even know exists? Iodine 131, strontium 90. One can lead to thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. The other can up your chances of developing leukemia. All falling to the ground like the worst kind of invisible fairy dust. But not to worry. The government promises us that the risk is so small, so teeny tiny, so very minute that it's hardly a risk at all. And you know our government is super honest and totally focused on the well-being of we the people. Except when it isn't. For example, the U.S. Department of Energy acknowledged doing 4 basic types of radiation experiments on human subjects from the 1940s to the 1970s. Dose-response studies looked at the biological impacts of radiation exposure. Tracer studies used radioisotopes to investigate the pathways and processes in the human body, as well as the impact of radiation on the body. And then they also did something called radionuclide metabolism studies. These were aimed at discovering not just how the radioisotopes were retained or excreted, but how they behaved inside the body. Then there were the experimental treatments for disease, and many of those became routine medical options. If you or someone you know has received radiation therapy for cancer, this is where all of that began. There are people alive today thanks to those therapies. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could thank the individuals who chose to be part of those medical breakthroughs? Well, unfortunately, we can't thank them. One, because the feds grimly acknowledge that informed consent or any kind of consent from a human subject wasn't even legally required until 1974. And 2, many of the human subjects involved in these radiation protocols had no idea that they were part of any experiment. To be fair, there were experiments using volunteer subjects. Sometimes the employees of whatever research facility was conducting the tests. There were experiments done using chronically ill patients, including children, and experiments that involved terminally ill patients. Prison inmates were often used, and in a handful of cases, the scientists themselves served as their own guinea pigs. In those days, before computers, record keeping wasn't optimal. Documentation was apparently half-assed and sketchy. The words the feds use is fragmented. Researchers weren't great about dates, so that made for a big old mess to sort out. And some of these experiments went down at universities and private hospitals, with the Department of Energy paying the bills, but not providing much in the way of oversight. It was far, far too easy for files to be misplaced, damaged, or destroyed. In February 1995, the U.S. Department of Energy, on the orders of Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary, published a little something called Human Radiation Experiments, the DOE roadmap to the story and the records. It's dense and dry and absolutely delightful if you're nerdy and enjoy paging through declassified documents. It covered 150 radiation experiments on human subjects, dating from the early 1940s through the early 1970s. And then, in July 1995, the DOE released another version with an additional 275 research programs they'd unearthed. I'll tell you what's shocking, but probably shouldn't be. It's just how loose and improvisational so many of these experiments appear to have been. Like the one where they got some volunteers to drink water laced with plutonium. To be fair, they did tell the men what they were drinking. They just said that the levels were so low that it was almost not even worth the bother, but why not just humor us and chug a lug?
The manifestations of radiation in the body are many and range from slight to severe. Loss of hair, nausea, bleeding, inability of the body to resist other ailments and make its own repair. These are some of them. And they may be climaxed by the ultimate symptom, death itself. However, complete recovery is more probable.
Now, if you had the misfortune of being a patient at the Elgin State Hospital in Elgin, Illinois between 1931 and 1933, you might have found yourself injected with radium as part of an experiment in treating mental health disorders. This was more than 15 years before the Argonne National Laboratory was chartered. And here's why that mattered. America's first national lab, Argonne's stated mission was cooperative research in nucleonics. When Argonne got their hands on Elgin State Hospital's records, they found a mess. Argonne gamely tried to locate the patients to figure out what, if any, impact the radium injections had on the health and longevity of these subjects, none of whom gave consent, and they weren't in any position to consent. But back in the 1930s, the attitude appeared to be, oh well, they're mental patients, so whatever. Defective and undesirable. Remember, this was a time when eugenics was the rage and selective breeding in humans to eliminate so-called inferior people and undesirables was a concept that was more widely embraced than any of us like to think about, because we like to imagine ourselves as much nobler than we really are. It just so happens that in 1933, during the Elgin Hospital radium experiment, over in Germany, the Nazis were busy passing their first eugenics policy, the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. This law required all physicians in Germany to record and register every patient with genetic-based illnesses. They made an exception for women over the age of 45, women past childbearing age. The Nazis had this maniacal fixation on controlling reproduction, which is crazy, right? Because can you even imagine such a thing happening today? And think about this. Hitler had only been in power for 6 months at that point. That's how fast a monstrous idea can become the law of the land. But back to the USA, let's talk about the Hanford Laboratory in Washington State. Part of the Manhattan Project, Hanford produced nearly 2/3 of the plutonium used in America's nuclear stockpile. You saw the movie Oppenheimer? The plutonium used in the Trinity test came from Hanford. So did the materials for the bombs that helped end World War II. It seems like if you wanted to work at Hanford, you needed to be up for anything, like volunteering to stand outside in a cloud of radiation and intentionally inhale, then submit to a slew of tests to measure just how much of that radiation had been taken in by the thyroid. 8 other Hanford employees spent a month drinking milk from cows fed iodine-131, which sounds benign, but isn't. Iodine-131 is a product of nuclear fission, a major source of contamination from the 1950s atomic bomb test to Chernobyl and the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011. Once again, the goal was to assess uptake by the human thyroid. I just hope those 8 Hanford employees at least got a pizza party as a thank you. Iodine-131 was the star of another study involving 65 psychiatric patients at a clinic in San Francisco. Diagnoses ranged from anorexia to manic depression to schizophrenia. The control group of so-called normal minds consisted of volunteers from the clinic's medical and clerical staff. The goal was to figure out if the thyroid functioned the same in people with a mental health disorder as it did in the normal population. Spoiler alert, there was zero difference. For nearly a decade, beginning in 1949, inmates at San Quentin were a buffet of human subject research. In one experiment, test subjects had blood drawn, which was laced with phosphorus-32 and then re-injected. We know now that phosphorus-32 can damage DNA and cause a host of other rough side effects, like nausea, cramps, inflammation of the lungs, inflammation of the abdominal wall, and bone marrow depression, which could be permanent. Bone marrow depression means a decrease in white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. But hey, these were criminals, right? Paying their debt to society one way or another. Another inmate experiment was conducted by renowned scientist Dr. Carl Heller. He wanted to test the effects of radiation on the testes. What dose would produce changes in human sperm, he wondered, and how long might it take for those cells to recover? He recruited subjects by offering them a free vasectomy. So thoughtful, right? Of course, the real motive was to prevent these men from going out post-radiation and fathering defective children. The inmates who agreed thought they were consenting to the vasectomy, not to the irradiation of their nuggets. Dr. Heller offered little in the way of information. The early subjects were told nothing about any future risk, and later subjects were given only the vaguest answers to their questions. And here's a wild detail. No Roman Catholic inmates were permitted to participate. Why? Because each test subject was required to produce weekly semen samples. The Catholic Church was like, that requires masturbation, so that is going to be a no from us. Dr. Heller built a special device that would give a precise calibrated dose of radiation from two sides. The test subjects, the inmates, laid face down with their scrotum slotted into a plastic box filled with warm water. Very spa-like so far. With the testes fully descended, thanks to that warm water, Heller would hit the button and zap. Acute burns of the skin were one side effect. Inflammation and bleeding were another. Pain was a strong possibility, as you can imagine. In 1976, a handful of these surviving participants filed lawsuits alleging lack of informed consent and inadequately supervised research. The depositions read like outtakes from a horror movie. Inmates being permitted to control their own dose of radiation. Vasectomies performed with no anesthetic of any kind. In his deposition, Dr. Heller admitted that he hadn't properly informed the subjects of the risks. He said he didn't want to scare them by talking about cancer. He insisted that he had used the phrase tumor of the testes, something echoed in many of the subjects' reports. Problem was, he allegedly told the men that the risk was 1 in a million, which was more than a little optimistic. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 1979, and the 9 plaintiffs split a whopping $2,215. That's about $9,628 in today's money. Seems low, doesn't it? But there you go.
The estimated dose needed to bring about permanent sterility exceeds the lethal dose. So obviously, sterility by radiation would be just incidental, a matter a dead man wouldn't worry about.
From employees at Oak Ridge volunteering to inhale airborne uranium oxide dust, to comatose terminally ill patients getting plutonium injected into their brains, to the 7 orphan children who were given milk contaminated with iodine-13 for 14 days, the Atomic Energy Commission stayed busy for decades. When you read the reports, it's so easy to forget that these were human beings with families and friends and hopes and dreams. It's all data and statistics, the humanity of all those test subjects smothered under technical language. It's impossible to tell their stories when we don't even know their names. Except there is at least one story we can tell, and it goes like this. Ebenezer Cade was a cement mixer employed by the J.A. Jones Construction Company in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Cade was headed to work on the morning of March 23, 1945, when he was badly injured in a car accident. His right kneecap and left femur were fractured, his right arm broken in 2 places. It was his bad luck that the deputy director of the Manhattan District Engineer Hospital, Dr. Heimer Friedel, had an agenda beyond providing life-saving care to patients. Dr. Friedel was an Army physician. He'd been stationed at Oak Ridge with explicit orders to protect the health and safety of the Manhattan Project. On that fateful morning in March 1945, when Eb Cade was brought into the ER, Dr. Friedel saw more than just another victim of an auto accident. Dr. Friedel saw what he described as a well-developed, well-nourished, colored male. He ordered Cade to be admitted, but the man's injuries were not to be treated. Which sounds barbaric, but at the time wasn't all that uncommon. These were the days when antibiotics were just coming into use and surgeries were often delayed if there was any possibility of infection that would put the patient at risk of sepsis. Cade, despite being in good health overall, suffered from tooth decay and obvious inflammation of his gums. As per usual, though, the records are vague and murky and unclear as to why Cade's fractures were allowed to go untreated. Benefit of the doubt? The medical team feared infection via gum disease. Sinister interpretation? Friedel had other plans for Eb Cade. You be the judge. Because delayed treatment for his injuries would turn out to be the least of Cade's problems. And Ebenezer Cade had no way of knowing that his car wreck had landed him in the crosshairs of a highly secretive program buried deep inside the Manhattan Project. Stafford Warren, head of the medical team, had arrived at the conclusion that controlled experimentation on human beings was critical to national security. How else to determine the effects, short and long term, of radiation on human beings? How much radioactive material will be toxic? How much would remain in the body after normal metabolic processes, and for how long? It was decided that civilian test subjects would be injected with polonium, plutonium, uranium, and americium. The experiments would be performed at hospitals affiliated with the Manhattan Project, Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, with 11 test subjects, Billings Hospital at the University of Chicago with 3 test subjects, University Hospital in San Francisco with 3 test subjects, and the Manhattan District Engineer Hospital in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with just 1 test subject, Eb Cade. The secrecy of it all can't be overstated. At the time, plutonium and uranium were so classified that they were identified only by code names. Atom bomb daddy J. Robert Oppenheimer knew about the planned human trials. He approved shipments of uranium and plutonium to be used in the experiments. He just didn't want any of them to be carried out at his facilities in Los Alamos. Not because he had any moral objection to the clueless human guinea pigs, more because he knew full well that exposure to plutonium could cause so much damage to staff that work on the atomic bomb might slow down or even be halted. Oppenheimer could not and would not take that risk. "Not in my backyard," said the father of the bomb. "We're doing important work here, okay?" So, following orders, Dr. Friedel left his patient's bedside in Tennessee and immediately wrote to his superior at Los Alamos, Dr. Louis Hempelman, saying that he believed he'd identified the optimal candidate for plutonium injection, 53-year-old Eb Cade. Cade, of course, completely unaware that upon entering the Manhattan District Hospital that March day in 1945, got a new name, HP-12. HP as in human product. On April 10th, 1945, more than 2 weeks after his car accident, with his injuries still untreated, Eb Cade was injected with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium. We know now that plutonium, whether it's inhaled or ingested or injected, or enters the bloodstream via a wound, heads straight for the lungs, the liver, and the bones. How long can plutonium atoms remain in the human body? Decades. Adding to that bad news, plutonium has a long, long half-life. Half-life means how long it takes the isotope to lose half its radioactivity. But there's more than one kind of plutonium isotope. There are 5 common plutonium isotopes. The longest has a half-life of 80.8 million years. The shortest has a half-life of 14.4 years. The plutonium-239 they injected into Eb Cade had a half-life of 24,100 years. Whatever the half-life, plutonium in the body becomes a long-term source of radiation to other cells in the neighborhood, an invisible biohazard with all the time and patience in the world. The physicians who were cheerfully shooting plutonium into Eb Cade's veins would like you to please understand that there is a difference, okay, between the administered dose, 4.7 micrograms, and the retained dose, which was, well, who even knows? That's why it's called an experiment, duh, try to keep up. Those doctors had no idea how much plutonium might remain in Cade's body. They guesstimated that he had another 10 to 20 years ahead of him based on his overall health and life expectancy at the time, which meant they couldn't rule out the possibility that Cade would develop a plutonium-related cancer. But who really knows, right? Why burden the man with the knowledge? Why make him fear a future that may never come? This mindset is about as far from informed consent as you can get, and at least one member of that medical team was troubled by it. It was the man holding the syringe. Dr. Joseph Howland was an Army doctor stationed at the Oak Ridge site. During the 1974 investigation into the human radiation trials conducted by the Atomic Energy Commission, Dr. Howland testified that there had been no consent of any kind on the part of Eb Cade, that he, Howland, had voiced his objections to injecting the man with plutonium. Those objections were forcefully overruled in writing by Howland's boss, Dr. Friedel. Friedel, of course, denied it and said that in any case, Howland was mistaken. It was another physician, Dr. Dwight Clark, who'd been assigned the task. Not surprisingly, the Atomic Energy Commission threw up its hands and was like, who can say? Their messy record keeping rearing its head. It's almost like they hired raccoons on meth to do their filing. Poor Eb Cade, who was probably in real pain from his untreated broken bones, and now starting to be more than a little bit scared by the fact that there seemed to be no exit plan for his hospital stay. What did he make of all those white coats hovering at his bedside? All he knew was that 4 hours after that strange injection, they were back drawing samples of his blood. 4 days later, they were telling him to hold absolutely still as they removed samples of his bones for biopsy. On the 5th day post-injection, they finally set his broken bones. Was he to be discharged at long last? No. Cade would remain in the hospital for up to 60 days longer so that his bodily excretions could be analyzed. And remember that tooth decay diagnosed when Cade was transported to the ER from the accident scene? Doctors proceeded to remove 15 of his teeth, which were then sent off to be tested for plutonium. And we know that because a letter written in September 1945 by a man named Captain David Goldring at the Oak Ridge site promised the Manhattan Project biochemist Dr. Wright Langham at Los Alamos that, quote,
more bone specimens and extracted teeth will be shipped to you very soon for analysis.
What we don't know is if Cade's teeth were being yanked for medical reasons and then sent out for testing, or if they just tore the man's teeth out because they were curious to see if plutonium had migrated into the enamel. We know very little about what Eb Cade made of this experience. For starters, no one seemed to care enough about the man's thoughts or feelings to have added them to his chart. Plus, you have to remember the time. A black man in 1945 in the state of Tennessee did not have the same legal rights and protections as the white men in white coats who stood by his hospital bed. Starting in 1866 with the passage of a law mandating separate schools for white and black children, segregation was serious business in Tennessee. Mixed-race marriage was a felony. Hotels, restaurants, and theaters had the legal right to refuse entry to black people. I'm not saying that the Manhattan Project doctors in Oak Ridge viewed Eb Cade as less of a human being than themselves, because I can't prove that. I'm just saying that given the historical context, it's not a huge stretch to say that these men did perhaps see Mr. Cade as their inferior. Oak Ridge was a secret place, not found on any maps until after 1959. Eb Cade was one of 7,000 African-American workers recruited to work on the Manhattan Project. They weren't told much of anything. Still, the jobs were appealing because President Franklin D. Roosevelt outlawed racial discrimination by federal agencies. Pay for African-American workers at Oak Ridge was better than what was typically available in the South. The opportunities, though, those were the same old. Domestic and menial labor, construction work, like the job Eb Cade held as a cement mixer. Recruited workers were sent by train and bus to this odd little town near Knoxville, a town patrolled by armed troops. There were signs everywhere that read, "See nothing, hear nothing, say nothing." Eb Cade and his fellow workers had no idea what their labor supported, And they didn't learn the truth until after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Eb Cade had been working for the Manhattan Project for more than 2 years at the time of his car accident. He knew better than to ask questions. Plus, he was injured and probably thought that the doctors knew best, as many of us would in that situation. But at some point, Cade clearly realized that whatever was happening was not in his best interest. Maybe it was the loss of 15 of his teeth that triggered his panic. Because one bright spring morning, a nurse pushed open the door to his room and was shocked to find his bed empty. Eb Cade, Human Project 12, was gone. Disappeared as though he'd never existed. And not just gone from that hospital bed, gone from Oak Ridge. Gone, gone, gone. This next part is hard to believe, given that it's the Manhattan Project at a top-secret hospital with a highly trained staff led by Army doctors. But here goes. The point of this plutonium injection experiment was to discover how much of the plutonium dose would be retained and how much would be excreted. This meant constant surveillance of Eb Cade's urine, among other things, but a really big and really stupid mistake was made early on. Cade's before injection and after injection urine samples were accidentally commingled. Oops. That meant there was no pre-plutonium baseline kidney function to measure against. So sloppy, so stupid, so embarrassing, so very unprofessional that when Big Boss Dr. Wright Langham had to present the Oak Ridge injection data at a conference, he fudged the screw-up by claiming that Eb Cade may have had a pre-existing kidney disease that rendered him less than an ideal subject. Since Langham was known as Mr. Plutonium, this version of events was permitted to stand. The doctor who objected to injecting Eb Cade wasn't the only person in the program who had concerns. On the other side of the country in San Francisco, the lead plutonium researcher at University Hospital, Dr. Joseph Gilbert Hamilton, was increasingly troubled by the work. Under his supervision, 3 people were injected, one of whom was a 4-year-old boy named Simeon Shaw. The child had bone cancer. He died 255 days after his plutonium injection. The other 2 subjects fared much better. Elmer Allen lived for 44 years, and Albert Stevens clocked another 20 years and earned bragging rights for being the man who survived the highest known accumulated dose of radiation of any human being. Dr. Hamilton, like the others in the program, justified not informing his patients about the plutonium being injected into their bodies. His reasoning was national security. And also, these test subjects all had cancer. Did he see them as having nothing to lose? And now it's time for a shocking little fun fact. Albert Stevens had been misdiagnosed. He didn't have cancer. He had a stomach ulcer. Oh well. At any rate, Hamilton's conscience must have been gnawing away at him. In 1950, Hamilton wrote a memo to the Atomic Energy Commission's Director of Biology and Medicine, Dr. Shields Warren. In it, he strongly advised replacing human subjects with chimpanzees. It was more than an attack of conscience. Hamilton was drawing some very uncomfortable parallels between his work with human radiation studies and the Nazis. Hamilton's memo urged the Atomic Energy Commission to rethink its position on human subjects, warning that the organization was risking what he called considerable criticism and that the program had a little of the Buchenwald touch about it. Buchenwald, as in the largest Nazi concentration camp in Germany. Buchenwald, as in the Nazi concentration camp where more than 56,000 souls were murdered. Experimentation on human beings was among the many atrocities committed at Buchenwald. There were the typhus vaccine trials, the maximum poison dose trials, and the horrifying burn tests. Prisoners were intentionally burned with white phosphorus, burns severe enough to cause death. And that was the point. How long would it take that burned prisoner to die? You can see why Dr. Hamilton was so troubled. He didn't have to carry the burden of guilt or remorse for long, however. Hamilton died in February 1957 at age 49 after a 2-year battle with leukemia. His colleagues openly expressed their belief that it was his long and repeated exposure to radiation that led to the blood cancer that took his life. And Eb Cade, human product 12, the injured and unwitting victim of the only plutonium injection experiment at Oak Ridge? What became of him after he fled his hospital bed? Cade resurfaced in Greensboro, North Carolina in April 1953 in his own obituary. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. The Greensboro Record, knowing nothing of Cade's story, gave his passing just one line in the May 2nd edition of the paper under the heading Negro Deaths. 40 years later, with Cade's identity and role in the human radiation experiments now public, a spokesperson for the Department of Energy told reporters that they had been unsuccessful in locating any next of kin. In November 1995, Department of Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary announced that Eb Cade was one of the individuals eligible to receive compensation under a $4.8 million settlement for victims of the human radiation experiments. Which sounds nice, but Cade was long dead, and he died never knowing the truth of what had happened to him in 1945 at the Manhattan District Engineer Hospital. It's very possible that no one would know his name today if not for the work of a journalist named Eileen Wellsome. While working as a reporter for the Albuquerque Tribune, Wellsome published a 3-part series in 1993 called The Plutonium Experiment. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her work in exposing the truth about the human radiation experiments, the truth about American citizens who didn't know and never consented to be the human guinea pigs for the atomic age.
In the fields of medicine and biochemistry, isotopes are performing near miracles of diagnosis and discovery. With radioactive sodium, doctors are solving more of the seeming mysteries of heart disease and circulatory disturbances. Radioactive phosphorus has been used to locate tumors in the brain and greatly simplify operations for their removal. Iodine-131 finds one of many uses in revealing conditions of the thyroid, and there are many more. New ways of using isotopes are being discovered constantly through the tireless work of modern pioneers in such fields as chemistry, metallurgy, medicine, and biology.
It's true that good came from the Atomic Energy Commission's research. We know now what levels of radiation exposure are harmful to humans. You benefit from this every time you get an X-ray. Workers at nuclear power plants are safer. People are alive today thanks to advances in nuclear medicine. Diseases that used to be straight-up death sentences, like acute myeloid leukemia, are now treatable. But we paid for so much of that knowledge with our humanity. Like when we dosed children with disabilities at the Fernald School in Massachusetts. We dosed them with radioactive calcium and iron without informing their parents. Like when we dosed more than 800 poor pregnant women in Tennessee with radioactive iron. Like when we left Eb Cade in a hospital bed with severe and untreated injuries while we waited for the delivery of the plutonium-239 he never agreed to have injected into his body. We can be grateful for advances in human knowledge and hold ourselves accountable for the unethical and atrocious ways that knowledge was obtained. We can do both at the same time. Yeah, it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit into our idea of ourselves as the world's hero. It doesn't fit into any of our mythic ideas of America. It's an ugly story, but it's one we have to tell. Because if we don't, there's a chance it happens again. And this time, maybe it happens to you.
But all are within man's power, subject to his command. On man's wisdom, on his firmness in the use of that power, depends now the future of his children and his children's children in the new world of the atomic age.
Next time on True Weird Stuff. They were teenage girls. They were living their lives. And then something terrible happened. Something turned those teenage girls into soldiers, into Nazi hunters and killers. And we've got their story on the next True Weird Stuff. I'm so heartbroken when I think about Eb Cade. There were so many people whose names we don't know, who suffered mightily during these atomic age human experiments. But because we know just enough of Eb Cade's story to make it a human story, I just can't shake it, Max. I cannot seem to let this one go.
You know, we do like to think of ourselves as a little bit more civilized in this country. But when you compared it to what they were doing at Buchenwald, it's like, yeah, that we were doing that. We were doing similar things here. We were.
We really were. I mean, we really were.
I say we. I don't think people, mainstream Germans knew what was going on, just like mainstream Americans didn't know what was going on here. What my question is, the people making these decisions, was there no moral conundrum about what they were doing to the people they were doing it to? I mean,
well, we have to put ourselves in the historical context, which does not excuse their behavior. Back in the 1930s, 1940s, right up through the 70s, when this whistle got blown, we did not think of people in psychiatric hospitals as fully competent human citizens, did we?
No.
The racism in this country that we're still battling today, and it's back and bigger than ever. We didn't think of Black people as fully human citizens in those decades. We did not consider children as a resource worthy of our protection. I mean, the number of children that were human subjects in these radiation experiments would bring you to your knees. They look what they did. Like at the Fernald School in Massachusetts, we could have done a whole episode just on that. But the Fernald School in Massachusetts, these were kids with disabilities. And so, hey, they're defective already. Why don't we mess with them?
Well, and at a certain time in this country, we would warehouse everybody together. No matter what it was that they had going on, whether they had Down syndrome, they had mental problems, they had alcoholism, they were all sort of warehoused. And it's just like, just get them out of society and stick them all together. And I saw when you said the thing that they were giving orphans milk. So just because they're orphans, they went, well, they're defective. They're orphans. We can do whatever we want to them. There's no,
exactly.
They have no adult that's going to say, no, you can't. I mean, that's really upsetting. The other thing that I really enjoyed was your description of the scrotums being zapped with radiation. Thank you for that, Sherry. I appreciated that a lot.
I was thinking about shades of the testicular testosterone experiment episode that we did.
Yeah.
It's called Ballsy, if you haven't listened to that one. It's about a different doctor at San Quentin who was mashing up testicles and injecting them into people to give them more vim and vigor and all of that. Goat testicles, people testicles. Like he was just crazed by the testes. Yeah. I wish I could believe that we've made a ton of progress in the direction of granting people their full humanity, regardless of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, job status. Like, I would love to feel like we've come a long way. I don't think we have. And I don't think we've come as far as we think we have, clearly.
No, I think we want to think that. Do you know what this makes me wonder? It always makes me wonder what's going on now that we don't know about, that we're going to find out 20, 30 years from now, that's happening now that we would be horrified to know about.
Yeah. And you know that there's something. And this was a one where I was like really wrestling with, but look at all the good. When you read these declassified documents for all of these different radiation experiments, many of them, to be fair, many of them were fairly benign. And by that, I mean they weren't injecting plutonium into someone's brain or giving a child radioactive milk. Those are not the benign ones. A lot of these were fairly benign, and they were working with, blood samples or tissue samples or whatever. And we learned an awful lot. Like when I was a child, leukemia was a death sentence. Now, there are people who don't survive leukemia, but it's considered a treatable disease now, which is a new thing. We've made extraordinary advances with breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer. We've made incredible advances with nuclear medicine, full stop. But people don't ever stop to think, how did we do that? Like, how did we get there?
Yeah.
And everybody, if you ask people, they'll go, oh, well, that's like laboratory animals, right? Like mice, rabbits, monkeys, because you don't want to think that your own government, was not turning a blind eye, but like actively recruiting and participating. This is not a blind eye.
Somebody was making a decision to grant money to somebody who was a doctor to make these experiments. What's astonishing is, and I guess there were people, as you pointed out along the way, were going, hey, I'm sorry, I've got a conscience and I have a sense of morals. This is immoral what we're doing. But you had to figure there were a bunch of people along the way who rationalized that this was absolutely perfectly fine to do to human beings.
Well, look at, I wanted to make a point of shouting out Dr. Joseph Howland in this episode, because he objected firmly and, was overruled, and he's military, you're in the military. Like, I think people that aren't, those of us that are not in the military, perhaps have no comprehension of military discipline and how that's its own separate world. And he eventually complied on orders. The other thing I want to talk about the amount of time Eb Cade spent in that hospital bed before they injected him and then treated his injuries, which were pretty significant. Okay. Yes, they feared infection, and there was not, a ready supply of antibiotics in 1945 like we enjoy today. But you also have to remember, no internet and no overnight FedEx. So Dr. Friedel had to write to his superiors in Los Alamos, who then had to greenlight his choice of this experimental test subject. And then the plutonium had to be delivered to Oak Ridge in an Army transport. It wasn't like, you're going to Amazon.com and getting prime delivery on your plutonium-239. So Ebb's delay for treatment was a function both of, we're a little worried about infection, and also how much time it took. Do you see what I'm saying? To just get the approval and the plutonium on board to do the experiment.
All I could think about was, did they duke him the hospital stay?
Well, they had to, because the man escaped. He escaped. He never paid a bill.
You mean he didn't get one of those envelopes with a window in it that says open immediately?
Yeah.
I wondered about that as well. I'm hoping they duked him the hospital stay at least.
Well, they were never able to find a next of kin to serve them the bill. And I think he went through a window. I mean, he got the hell out of there.
Unlikely so.
It's also, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, like, you saw one facet of an enormous prism, right, of the atomic age. Oak Ridge, it's fascinating to me that they built the Oak Ridge Laboratory and the Manhattan District Engineer Hospital and all of the housing for all of the support personnel. All of that was built, and it was a secret. It was not on the map. Think about that. Think about how fascinating that is. The idea of this secret city and all of the things that were happening at that time. And you could get away with it back then. People didn't have drones. They didn't have, Facebook. Like they didn't have, you didn't have a camera on your phone. And it was a very different world. So that all by itself is fascinating. And Eb Cade, all he knew was that because it was a federal construction job, the money was so much better than he could have made on a civilian project at that time. Like, you think he knew that at any time he might be plucked out of the crowd for this?
How could he have any way of knowing? I mean, this is the stuff of horror movies. This is the stuff of Saw movies. Hi, we're going to inject you with some plutonium. Oh, terrible. And then we're not going to set your broken bones for a while. So just lay there in agony and enjoy. Oh, we're going to pull your teeth too. 15 of them.
I mean, terrible. And so they had a ward filled with terminally ill patients, many of whom were comatose. And the attitude was, they're dying anyway. Let's see what happens if we shoot plutonium right into their brains. And I know there are people that would go, well, they are dying anyway. And you just have to constantly interrogate your own humanity. Like, okay, yeah, they are dying anyway, but shouldn't they get a say? Because here's what you don't know. That plutonium injection right into their brain, what happens as a result of that? Do they spend their last hours alive in excruciating agony? How can you be so cavalier about what you do to another human being? Like, it's mind-blowing to me. And like the little boy, the 4-year-old boy, Simeon Shaw, who was part of the human test cohort at the Manhattan Project Hospital in San Francisco. Yes, he had bone cancer. He did. And back then, very likely a death sentence. And he did die 255 days after the injection. You might say, well, maybe he would have died sooner. Or what difference if he died 255 versus 275? He was probably suffering. But do you hear yourself?
Yeah.
How about if that was your 4-year-old? Do you hear yourself?
Well, the thing that's interesting too is no two people are going to react well, I say no two people are exactly, but just because you have something happen doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to develop it because of the way genetics are. Our genetics, you have one person that smokes until they're 100 years old and never seems to have any problems with it. And then you have other people that get lung cancer when they're in their 20s,
Yeah.
You don't know. You don't know.
You don't know. So one thing you can say is when they first started working on the atom bomb, they really didn't know what the impact of radiation was on the human body. Again, if you saw the Oppenheimer movie, do you remember the scene when the bomb fired and all the soldiers standing right in the field with it were told to hit the mattress?
Mm-hmm.
LOL. Like, that's any kind of protection, right? They did not know. And they felt that this amoral experimentation on human beings was justified by the overwhelming need to have that knowledge. So you always have to put yourself back in the historical moment, but damn.
Well, it was a big deal in Las Vegas if they were doing one of those out in the desert to go and watch it. And certainly those people had some radiation from that.
There's an entire community of people called the downwinders that were living downwind of the Trinity test site. And those folks got whomped with radiation fallout. And the data is really frightening. And that's a whole separate, they deserve their own story. And maybe we'll do an episode on that down the line at some point. That's its own entire thing, because the soldiers at Los Alamos, all the personnel at Los Alamos, they may not have known all of what was possible, but they were aware of what was happening. They knew they were working on the atomic bomb. The downwinders were just like, it was Tuesday. You know what I mean? They were just living their lives.
They
They didn't
have
know.
a way of knowing.
In the same way that these test subjects didn't know. And I find it interesting that when you realize that every single person born in the contiguous United States has been subjected to radioactive fallout, that's a thought, isn't it?
It is.
That's something to think about. So let me tell you a quick little story. My father had one sister, and when she was quite young, like 33, she was diagnosed with very, very aggressive breast cancer. So this is back in I wish that I had been older when this happened. I would have asked questions, but I was a little kid. And she was sent away. She had a double mastectomy, and it was pretty barbaric back then. Now things are different, but her body was butchered. And they did that to save her life. So I'm not saying that the doctors were sloppy. It was just the time. And they sent her away to a hospital in New York State, probably Strong in Rochester, for all I know, for an experimental radiation protocol. And they had her in a room. She couldn't have visitors. And the medical people that tended to her were in full radiation biohazard, lead shielded outfits. I know this from the stories I've been told in her description of it. She's gone now. There was concern that her breast cancer had metastasized, and it ultimately did. It metastasized to colon cancer. So they inserted this sort of radioactive cylinder into her body through her vaginal canal. And that was supposed to irradiate these cancer cells that were spreading and save her life. And it did. But her internal organs were fused and burned, and the damage was catastrophic. And she had to live with, and just in her memory, I will not describe some of what happened to her and the scar tissue. She would have to periodically go back to that hospital, and they would break the scar tissue manually, with their hands. It was agonizing, and she was disfigured and scarred and did not have the same level of functionality that the factory settings. And she lived for another 20 years beyond the initial diagnosis, but there was never a day where she didn't carry the pain and the difficulty of managing her body despite all of this horrific radiation damage. And it was not in vain. She was one of many people that were part of these experimental protocols with consent, right? So now this is 1977, maybe, I think. So this is, we're past the point of this disclosure and the Geneva Convention, the World Health Organization. Everyone has unilaterally agreed that human beings have to consent to being part of a medical experiment. So she did consent. She didn't understand what she was consenting to. None of us do, right? But because of her consent and her suffering and her participation, people don't go through that anymore. But having seen what she endured, she died shortly after I got out of college. Having seen what she endured and knowing the brutality that it left, the wreckage of her body that was left, I don't know, maybe that kind of set me up, predisposed me to feel more fierce and protective of somebody like Eb Cade. It's really easy to read about it in a book or hear about it on a podcast or, in a passing thing on 60 Minutes or whatever. If you read these declassified DOE reports, they're very, very dry. I mean, the only one that really comes to life is the testicle experiments. Those are described in such careful, loving detail that it's crazy. Let's drop those ballsies into that hot water, fellas,
Sometimes I want to interrupt you and go, I just want you to know this is making me really uncomfortable. Please continue.
What did you think about, side note. Isn't it interesting that Catholic inmates were prevented from participating, not because it was immoral or inhumane or dangerous, but because we can't have them spanking the bishop in order to get you a semen sample?
I'll reveal something one time when I was, I don't know, teenager somewhere in there. And I went to face confession with a priest, and he looked at me and he said, if you ever tell me this again, I'll throw you out of here. He says, let's talk to what you're doing in your life. He says, if you go to hell on this, it's on my head.
I mean, really, I just have to say, I'm going to just take you to 1940 and they're still yanking on about the masturbation thing. That's crazy to me. Like that, folks, let it go.
Well,
let it go.
They did clean up their act a little bit after Vatican II with some of that craziness. Although, 100%.
Not 100%, but you got to say all those Roman Catholic inmates at San Quentin, and oh my God, is San Quentin not just the most happening spot for crazy?
I know. Wasn't in San Francisco too, where they were doing the experiments where they were giving the guys the Johns with the prostitutes. They were dropping acid and monitoring what they were doing.
Yeah,
that was a hotbed of crazy back then.
It's so everybody thinks that the Manhattan Project was just at Los Alamos, but the Manhattan Project was at the Philadelphia Naval Yard, and we talked about that in our episode about the disappearing ship. It was in Chicago, San Francisco, Tennessee, New York. The Manhattan Project was in a lot of places, y'all. Not just in Los Alamos. Not just where they tested the bomb. The Manhattan Project was kind of everywhere and very secretive, obviously, for obvious reasons.
And by the way, if you haven't listened to the episode Tripping Johns, I think it was one of our first half dozen episodes when we started doing True Weird Stuff. I had no idea that was going on. That was government funded. I had no idea that level of crazy was going on. Listen to that episode. Your jaw will be open the whole time.
And that's all. I mean, that's all like factual declassified stuff. Like you don't have to, like there are a lot of things I would love to do an episode on, but I can't find enough facts to back up the story. Like I'm mesmerized by like the vanishing staircases in national parks. I can't do an episode on something that I can't find a single factual source for. But the United States government experimenting on children, widows, orphans, the sick, the dying, babies, inmates, people in mental hospitals, random passersby. How much time do you have? Like it's just everywhere. Everywhere.
Well, I'm glad our tax money's been well spent.
I do. I just want to say, I think we can totally own up to these atrocities and be very grateful for the knowledge that we now have. Because who among us doesn't have a family member or a friend or a coworker or a neighbor whose life has not been spared thanks to advances in chemotherapy and radiation? Can anybody out there not throw up a hand? No one, right? Like we really, really and truly have come so far. But what's the harm? Like, are we so childish and defensive and narcissistic that we can't say we have really come so far and we owe an enormous debt to the people who had no idea they were our guinea pigs? And we have to be accountable, and we have to take steps to make sure these kinds of things don't ever happen again. Why is it so hard for us to do that, do you think?
I don't know. I think there's some things people just don't want to look at. They'd rather stick their head in the sand.
I went to Catholic school. I went to a Catholic prep school for high school. And Max and I, we're probably going to get visited by the Vatican because between us, we are not maybe the best ambassadors for any of that. But I went to a Catholic I'm very thankful. My grandmother pawned jewelry to put me in a school because she so believed in my future. And I will never, ever be able to repay that. But one of my teachers was an elderly nun who taught English. And she was very like, ooh, sort of apple cheeked and silver haired and, always lenient with us. Right. And so nobody really took her very seriously. And she was a brilliant mathematician, but she would not teach math. She would only teach literature because as a young woman, she had been a mathematician with the Manhattan Project. She was not at Los Alamos. She was at one of the other many Manhattan Project sites. And her experience working as a mathematician for the Manhattan Project and the resulting atomic bomb, she gave up her career and her academic pursuits and she went into religious life. And that was the end for her. She felt that that what humanity had unlocked and unleashed was more than, I guess, her conscience could reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
And you would never have known in a million years. We called her everything from Sister Mary English to Sister Mary Office to Sister Mary Library, depending where she was, right? Like we never, only Catholic school kids can even relate to that, right? Like
and here she is, somebody with a real moral conscience about things who's trying to give back to children. And I know, I think about some of the stuff I did too, and I'm like, oh.
Like we just called the nuns, like they would all have like real nun names, but we called them by whatever task they were involved in.
Yeah, we had Sister Mary Chemistry and Sister Mary Library. We did the same thing.
Sister Lisa Biology, like we had, whatever, right?
Sister Pencil Nose.
It was
Sister
terrible.
Elephant Ankles.
So as a child, as a kid, as a student in her library or her classroom, I didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project besides like the atomic bomb, right? That was all I knew. And I didn't know anything about her journey because she never, ever, ever talked about it. You found out about it after she died when you read her obituary. Like that's how you found out. And after she passed away, one of my teachers was a priest, and he was a very important figure in my life. He understood that I was dealing with some stuff at home that made it hard for me at school, and he made a lot of my future happen by being so incredibly supportive and nurturing and tough on me too. Like he wouldn't let me make excuses. Like he made me be accountable. But he was the one who told me, Sister Mary Office, she could have been anything. And he told me just the barest outlines of her story. And I thought about her when I watched the Oppenheimer movie, and I thought about her when we were working on this episode. Because to your point, Max, there were plenty of people with a conscience, plenty of people who questioned and had doubts and who didn't think that giving radiation-laced milk to orphans was like what we needed to be doing. There were a lot of people along the way. So it's not like everybody was ruthless and unscrupulous. That's just not true. And if there are any surviving descendants of Ebenezer Cade out there, I hope the government found them and gave them Mr. Cade's share of that legal settlement. I can tell you that newspapers all over North Carolina right through the 90s, in the classified section where you have to post legal notices.
Yeah.
You've seen them like for bankruptcy or whatever. Pretty much every newspaper because he died in Greensboro, North Carolina, every newspaper in North Carolina ran these notices in their classified sections for a long time looking for next of kin. Because, he was part of this federal settlement. And the problem is, can't tell you if they ever found them, because Eb Cade was a black man in pre-civil rights America. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what that means, you probably don't want to hear it from me.
If you don't know what that means, do a little reading.
Yeah.
If you don't know what that means, please.
Yeah. Please. Because those dark days are coming back. I mean,
they can if we don't watch it. They can always. Experience has shown we think we evolve, and then we don't. So
the thing about the darkness is, how like when you come home at night and nobody's left any lights on, and you pull up into your driveway and your house is so dark, and you're a little bit nervous, but you go in and you flip the light, and the porch light comes on, and the lamp comes on, and suddenly you're in this little golden glowing island. It's still dark all around you, but you're in this safe puddle of warmth and security. That's kind of how civilization is. You've got this little puddle of light, but the darkness is all around you. And if you don't stay on top of it, it comes right back in. And anybody paying any attention to the world today, right now, knows it's gotten a little bit closer and a little bit darker. Now, in that spirit, on the next episode of True Weird Stuff, we're going to tell you a story that Max and I are both just absolutely obsessed with and fascinated by. We all know that there ain't nothing scarier than a teenage girl. I mean, a teenage girl can make you feel 2 inches tall just by cutting her eyes at you. Well, not all that long ago, 3 teenage girls banded together and joined the resistance and set about as a 3-girl Nazi assassination hit squad. Teenage Mutant Nazi Hunters on the next True Weird Stuff. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, hit the plus button in the top right corner, and now it helps an independent podcast like ours to get discovered. And we really appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, and review True Weird Stuff.
Hit our website, trueweirdstuff.com, for show notes and photos and videos when we have it, and bonus content. Everything True Weird is waiting for you at trueweirdstuff.com.
And follow True Weird Stuff on Instagram and Twitter.
True Weird Stuff is a Now Media production. Our executive producer is Anthony Garcia. The show is written and hosted by me, Sherry Lynch, along with my deeply weird director, Max Sweeten. Our equally odd producer is Carrie Bowser. Additional production by the mysterious Stephen Call. Our digital witch and social media cult leader is Heather Furr. Original graphics by Kevin Nash. Original artworks by Olivia Axland. True Weird original music composed and performed by Jack Griffin and Zane Nash. Copyright 2024 Now Media. All rights reserved. All wrongs remembered.